Look at the person sitting across from you. If they are a true empath, you are looking at the most dangerous psychological containment unit in the room. For months, maybe years, you have watched them absorb the microscopic atmospheric shifts of every room they enter. They feel your anxiety before you've even consciously processed the cortisol spike in your own bloodstream. They take the anger, the manipulation, the subtle passive-aggressive slights, and they swallow them. They process them. They hold them in a psychological chamber that most people assume has an infinite capacity. This is the fatal mistake of the behavioral predator. They mistake absorption for submission. They view patience as a lack of tactical awareness. But right now, beneath the surface of that calm, accommodating exterior, something catastrophic is happening. The pressure is reaching critical mass. Every human being has a breaking point, but when a highly empathetic person reaches theirs, it doesn't look like a standard emotional meltdown. It doesn't look like a loud, screaming argument or a dramatic display of tears. It looks like absolute, terrifying silence. It looks like the sudden, total freezing of micro-expressions. The warmth in their eyes, that soft, reflective quality you've relied on to make yourself feel secure, instantly evaporates. In its place is a cold, dead, clinical stare. They are no longer feeling you. They are profiling you. When an empath reaches their breaking point, the emotional operating system completely shuts down, and a hyper-rational, survival-driven analytical engine boots up in its place. Every piece of behavioral data they have quietly collected about you while they loved you, every insecurity you confessed, every manipulation tactic you tried to hide, every flaw in your psychological armor is suddenly weaponized. Not out of malice, but out of absolute necessity. If you are a manipulator, a narcissist, or simply someone who has taken an empathetic person for granted, this moment is the psychological equivalent of walking into a room and realizing the air has been entirely sucked out of it. You will scramble for leverage, you will try the old triggers, you will attempt to play the victim, and you will watch those tactics bounce off them like paper arrows against reinforced steel. By the time we finish this analysis today, you will understand exactly what occurs in the human brain when the ultimate shock absorber snaps. You will learn the exact micro-behaviors that signal the shift from healer to executioner, why the narcissist experiences a profound, panic-inducing withdrawal when this line is crossed, and how an empath uses absolute detachment as the ultimate weapon of psychological warfare. If you are an empath on the edge, this is your manual. If you are the one pushing them, this is your warning. Pay very close attention to the shifts we are about to decode, because once this line is crossed, there is no behavioral reset button. Most people believe that human behavior is linear. They think that if you push someone, they will push back gradually, louder and louder, until a fight breaks out. They are wrong. There is a specific class of human being whose behavioral curve is completely binary. It is an on-off switch of staggering proportions. I am talking about the highly empathetic individual. For a sustained period, their system operates entirely on, absorbing baseline friction, offering radical compliance, and decoding the pain of others to smooth over interpersonal conflict. But right now, as we sit in this room, thousands of these individuals are approaching the exact millimeter where that switch flips to off. The reason you cannot afford to look away from this presentation today is simple. Understanding this breaking point is the difference between surviving a relationship collapse and being completely psychologically dismantled by it. If you do not know how to read the silent warning signs of an empath's final boundary, you will inevitably cross it, and the consequences of that crossing are absolute, irreversible, and permanent. We are going to map the exact anatomy of the snap. To understand the breaking point, we must first look at the mechanics of empathy through a behavioral lens. An empath functions as an emotional mirror. When you interact with them, they reflect your validation, your worth, and your emotional safety back to you. For a manipulator, this reflection is oxygen. It is the fuel that stabilizes their fragile ego. But when the breaking point is triggered, the mirror shatters. The first thing you will observe is a total flatlining of autonomic nervous system responses during conflict. Where they used to show signs of distress, pacing, vocal tremors, dilated pupils, or defensive posturing, they now sit completely still. Their heart rate drops. Their voice lowers by an octave, adopting a flat, measured, rhythmic cadence. What is happening inside their brain? The amygdala, overwhelmed by sustained emotional toxicity, has handed the controls over to the prefrontal cortex. The emotional empathy center has gone dark to protect the organism, and the cognitive analytical center has taken full command. They are no longer absorbing your stress. They are observing your baseline behavior. They are analyzing your syntax, tracking your eye movements, and cataloging your desperation. You have ceased to be a partner or a friend. You have become a subject under a microscope. An empath knows you better than you know yourself. Why? Because while you were busy manipulating or taking them for granted, they were paying hyper-vigilant attention to your emotional terrain. They know exactly what triggers your shame, what fuels your arrogance, and where your deepest insecurities lie. During the absorbent phase, they protect those vulnerabilities. They walk on eggshells to avoid hurting you. But when the breaking point is reached, that protection protocol is permanently deleted from their behavioral software. When they speak, and they will speak with terrifying brevity, they will use your exact psychological profile to neutralize the threat. They don't yell, they don't insult, they simply state the absolute, unvarnished behavioral truth about who you are, what you are doing, and why you are doing it. They strip away your narrative, your gaslighting, and your rationalizations with surgical precision. It is an intellectual and emotional execution, delivered with the calm demeanor of a pilot landing an aircraft. The final stage of an empath's breaking point is what behaviorists call total relational erasure, or what I refer to as the vault. When the switch flips, the empath doesn't seek revenge. Revenge requires emotional investment, and they have zero liquidity left to spend on you. Instead, they implement a complete psychological blackout. You become invisible. If you walk into the room, their eyes will track right through you as if you are a piece of ambient furniture. If you speak, your words will register as mere background noise. This is not the silent treatment, which is a childish manipulation tactic designed to get a reaction. This is the absolute absence of reaction. They have rewritten their internal cognitive map, and you are no longer a feature on it. This creates an immediate, severe behavioral crisis for the manipulator. The narcissist or controller relies entirely on feedback loops to regulate their own identity. When they yell, they need you to cry. When they ignore you, they need you to beg. When the empath reaches the breaking point and provides nothing, no anger, no tears, no hatred, just a cold, analytical vacuum, the manipulator's system experiences an immediate feedback loop failure. They will rapidly cycle through different behavioral scripts, first rage, then pity, then bargaining, then intense love bombing. But as they cycle through these tactics, they will notice the empath watching them with a look of mild, detached curiosity. The empath is watching the machine break down. And it is in that exact moment that the manipulator realizes the terrifying truth. They didn't break the empath, they broke themselves. To truly understand what happens when a highly empathetic individual reaches their absolute limit, you have to dismantle the fundamental misunderstanding that society has about the nature of empathy itself. The common consensus is that an empath is a soft, malleable entity, a sponge designed to endlessly soak up the emotional runoff of the world around them. People look at their patience, their constant accommodation, and their uncanny ability to sit in the fire of someone else's chaos, and they mistake it for weakness or a lack of tactical boundaries. They assume that because the sponge keeps absorbing, it can do so indefinitely. This is a catastrophic miscalculation of behavioral mechanics. An empath's tolerance is not an open, infinite field. It is a highly pressurized, heavily engineered containment system. Every slight, Every manipulation, every drop of passive-aggressive toxicity, and every narcissistic demand that they accept is not magically neutralized. It is stored. It is compressed and held inside a psychological chamber that requires an immense amount of internal energy to maintain. The empath is consciously choosing to burn their own psychological fuel to keep that containment wall intact, absorbing the impact of your dysfunction so the relationship doesn't shatter. They do this because their primary baseline programming is optimization and healing. They prioritize the structural integrity of the connection over their own immediate comfort. But no matter how well engineered a containment unit is, it remains subject to the laws of pressure. The predator or the taker operates under the delusion that they are winning, that their tactics are working flawlessly, because they aren't seeing any immediate pushback or outward signs of structural fatigue. They don't see the microscopic stress fractures forming along the perimeter of the empath's psyche. They don't realize that the empath is tracking every single cross-boundary violation, not out of resentment, but because their nervous system is naturally logging the data. The volume of emotional radiation being forced into that containment unit is cumulative. When you deal with a standard personality type, they vent pressure dynamically. They argue, they snap, they push back in small, measurable increments that allow you to gauge where their boundaries are. The empath does not do this. They keep the containment sealed, maintaining a deceptive outward appearance of calm, grace, and compliance, which completely masks the dangerous level of internal psi rising within their system. This creates a false sense of security for the manipulator, who pushes harder and further, completely unaware that they are rapidly approaching a hard, unyielding physical limit. The breaking point occurs when the internal pressure of that accumulated data exactly equals the maximum structural integrity of the containment wall. It is the precise millisecond where the empath's subconscious realizes that continuing to absorb your toxicity will result in the total destruction of their own selfhood. At that exact threshold, the system undergoes a sudden, violent structural failure. But because this is a highly controlled psychological architecture, the failure doesn't result in an outward explosion that damages the surroundings. Instead, the containment walls implode inward, instantaneously crushing the emotional operating system that allowed the absorption to happen in the first place. The capacity to absorb is permanently disabled, leaving behind a cold, dense core that is completely impervious to further manipulation. When the internal containment system finally gives way under the weight of sustained emotional toxicity, the outward transformation manifests not through a grand, explosive gesture, but through an immediate and chilling shift in baseline behavioral metrics. In the field of human profiling, we track deviations from an individual's established baseline to detect hidden shifts in cognitive and emotional states. And with an empath, this deviation is absolute. Under normal operating conditions, an empath emits a highly visible, continuous stream of pro-social behavioral cues designed to signal safety and establish rapport. Their vocal warmth is pronounced, characterized by varied inflections, a soft timbre, and a rhythmic cadence that instinctively pacifies the nervous systems of those around them. Their facial expressions are fluid and hyper-reactive, constantly mirroring your emotions to provide validation. They exhibit high levels of micro-reciprocity, the subtle nods, the leaning forward, the open posture, and the prolonged, soft eye contact that indicates deep psychological engagement. The moment the breaking point is reached, every single one of these metrics undergoes an instantaneous structural freeze. The vocal warmth does not gradually fade. It drops off a cliff, replaced by a flat, measured, deadpan delivery that lacks any emotional resonance whatsoever. The voice drops an octave, entering a tonal range that is purely informative and devoid of any desire to please, pacify, or connect. Simultaneously, the facial muscles undergo a profound relaxation that resembles a physical mask. The micro-expressions that used to flicker across their face at a rate of 25 frames per second, the subtle raises of the brow indicating sympathy, the soft parting of the lips to interject with comfort, simply vanish. This is the physiological manifestation of the emotional empathy center shutting down to protect the organism, leaving behind a hyper-rational, cold, analytical engine. If you look into their eyes during this transition, you are no longer seeing a mirror that reflects your ego or absorbs your pain. You are looking at a lens. The soft, receptive quality of their gaze is replaced by a hyper-focused, unblinking state of high arousal observation. They are tracking your blink rate, observing the sudden tension in your jawline, and mapping the frantic adjustments you are making as you realize you have lost control of the room. Their posture shifts from an open, vulnerable tilt to a rigid, grounded alignment that projects absolute psychological mass. They no longer lean into your narrative or move closer to soothe your anger. They sit or stand with a terrifying stillness, completely immune to the emotional atmospheric pressure of the room. For anyone who has relied on the empath's emotional feedback loop to stabilize themselves, this sudden flatlining of behavioral metrics produces an immediate sense of profound vertigo. The manipulator attempts to read the empath's face for cues of anger, hurt, or guilt, the standard emotional currencies of a conflict, and finds absolutely nothing to latch onto. The empath has ceased to be a participant in the emotional ecosystem and has instead become an objective observer of it. This behavioral freeze is the unmistakable signal that the empath has moved out of the realm of relational negotiation and into the realm of absolute tactical assessment. Once the baseline metrics have flatlined and the emotional operating system has gone dark, the empath enters a phase that is deeply terrifying to any behavioral predator: the cold weaponization of accumulated data. To understand why this occurs, you must recognize that an empath is not merely a passive feeler of emotions. They are a hypervigilant, subconscious data gatherer. Throughout the entire duration of the relationship, while they were loving you, forgiving you, and absorbing your psychological garbage, their mind was acting as a flawless, silent recording device. They were tracking every micro-expression you leaked when you thought they weren't looking, cataloging the exact syntax of your lies, and mapping the deep-seated insecurities that drive your need for control. They knew the precise moments your arrogance was masking a profound fear of abandonment, and they memorized every confession you ever made about your past failures or hidden shames. During the absorbent phase, this massive repository of psychological data was kept under strict lock and key, guarded by the empath's own cognitive biases, their deep capacity for love, and their desire to protect you from harm. They actively chose to suppress their own analytical intelligence to preserve the illusion of your goodness. But when the breaking point flips that internal switch, those emotional safeguards are instantly and permanently deleted from the system. The cognitive biases dissolve, the rose-colored filtering mechanism is shattered, and the empath suddenly looks at the predator through a lens of absolute, clinical, and unvarnished objectivity. The data is no longer being stored to facilitate healing. It is pulled into the active workspace of the prefrontal cortex to be used as a precision instrument of neutralization. This is not done out of a desire for vengeance or malicious retaliation, because revenge still implies an emotional connection, a desire to make the other person hurt so that they understand the pain they caused. This is entirely different. This is a survival-driven execution of cold logic. When the empath speaks during this phase, they do not scream, they do not accuse, and they do not engage in the chaotic back and forth of a typical argument. Instead, they deliver a highly concentrated, surgically precise behavioral profile of the person standing before them. They speak with a calm, terrifying clarity, detailing the exact anatomy of the manipulator's behavior, the pathetic motivations behind their gaslighting, and the specific psychological flaws they have been trying so desperately to hide. They strip away the manipulator's carefully constructed narrative, exposing the raw, ugly truth of reality with the detached demeanor of a coroner performing an autopsy. Every word is calibrated to hit the exact center of gravity of the manipulator's ego. Because the empath knows the subject's psychological vulnerabilities better than anyone else on Earth, their insights cut directly through all defensive armor, bypassing the subject's ability to deflect or deny. The manipulator is suddenly forced to look into a mirror that doesn't reflect their idealized self, but rather the small, desperate, broken mechanics of their actual behavior. The wealth of information that was once used to comfort and protect the predator is turned inside out, transformed in a single moment into a definitive, unarguable psychological verdict from which there is absolutely no escape. Following the surgical deconstruction of the manipulator's psychological profile, the empath initiates the final, irreversible phase of their behavioral transition, a phenomenon known as the implementation of the vault. In the lexicon of behavioral psychology, this represents the absolute maximum threshold of relational erasure. Up until this specific millisecond, the manipulator has been operating under the assumption that any response, even a cold or highly analytical one, means they still possess a tether to the empath's psychic energy. They are accustomed to the standard dynamics of human conflict, where anger, confrontation, and verbal exposure still signal an ongoing investment in the relationship. But when the empath steps into the vault, all emotional liquidity is permanently withdrawn from the transaction. This is not the standard behavioral pattern of the quote-unquote silent treatment, which is a passive-aggressive manipulation tactic designed to elicit a specific response, punish the partner, or force compliance through artificial distance. The silent treatment carries a heavy, toxic, energetic charge. It is loud in its absence of words, practically begging the other person to chase, plead, or acknowledge the wall. The vault, however, is a complete psychological blackout. It is the absolute, unyielding presence of nothing. When an empath places you in this space, you cease to exist within their cognitive mapping of reality. The neural pathways that once fired with empathy, warmth, and care for your well-being are systematically overridden by a hardwired survival protocol that treats you as a completely neutralized, non-viable threat. If you walk into the room, their optical tracking will pass completely through you, as if you are nothing more than a localized disturbance in the air currents or a static piece of background furniture. If you speak to them, your vocal frequencies do not trigger a micro-expression, a defensive twitch, or a tightening of the jaw. They register as empty ambient noise, completely devoid of meaning. The empath's brain has completely rewritten the baseline parameters of your existence, moving you from the category of person to be understood to entity that has been permanently deleted. This creates a profound structural vacuum in the immediate environment. The empath does not block you out of anger. They block you out of absolute clinical necessity because their system has recognized that you are an active drain on their psychological sovereignty. They do not look at your text messages with tears in their eyes, and they do not struggle with the urge to check your social media profiles. The detachment is total, clean, and terrifyingly thorough. The door to the vault is exceptionally heavy, and it only swings one way. There is no negotiation, no probationary period, and no series of apologies that can reverse the lock once the tumblers have fallen into place. For the empath, this is the ultimate act of reclaiming their own energetic perimeter. They pull all of their emotional mirrors back inward, sealing themselves off in a fortified psychological sanctuary where your words, your threats, your tears, and your presence can no longer generate a single hertz of neural activity. You are left screaming into a void that refuses to echo your voice back to you, completely locked out of the mind you spent months or years exploiting, realizing too late that the door has been shut forever. The natural consequence of the empath implementing the vault is the immediate, catastrophic behavioral destabilization of the manipulator, a phase we define as the predator's panic. In behavioral profiling, we understand that a control-oriented personality type does not generate their own internal validation or emotional stability. Instead, they operate like a parasite, relying entirely on continuous feedback loops from their target to regulate their own ego and sense of reality. They require the empath to react, to absorb their toxicity, to defend themselves, or to cry, because those reactions provide definitive proof that the manipulator still holds psychological leverage. The response is the fuel that keeps their sense of superiority alive. The moment that feedback loop drops to absolute zero, the manipulator's internal operating system experiences an immediate systemic failure. They are suddenly thrust into a state of acute emotional and psychological withdrawal, forced to confront the terrifying emptiness of their own internal landscape without the empath's mirror to soften the view. This triggers a rapid-fire progression of desperate, erratic behavioral scripts as the manipulator frantically tries to find a single frequency that will generate a spark of life from the empath. The first script they deploy is typically heightened aggression or intensified rage, executing louder accusations, sharper gaslighting, and more dramatic threats in an attempt to trigger the empath's old defensive compliance metrics. But as these explosive tactics bounce off the empath's absolute, unblinking stillness, the predator's confidence begins to fracture, forcing them to rapidly pivot to the complete opposite end of the behavioral spectrum. They will instantly switch to a script of profound victimhood and self-pity, weeping, manufacturing crises, or confessing artificial insights about their own flaws in a desperate play to activate the empath's deeply ingrained rescue instincts. When that too fails to elicit even a microscopic facial twitch, the manipulator enters a state of true operational panic, spiraling into erratic love bombing, offering extravagant promises of change, or attempting to use old, highly personal inside jokes to bypass the psychological firewall. It is a pathetic, chaotic display of behavioral cycling, akin to a malfunctioning machine throwing random levers in a burning factory. As the manipulator burns through their entire tactical inventory, they are forced to look at the empath, who is watching this frantic performance with a look of mild, entirely detached curiosity. The empath is not enjoying the spectacle, nor are they feeling smug. They are simply observing the breakdown of a mechanical system that no longer has any power over them. For the predator, this realization is the ultimate psychological horror. They realize that they did not successfully dominate, break, or conquer the empath. Rather, through their own unbridled greed and endless boundary violations, they have systematically destroyed the only source of pure validation they had. They have pushed the most resilient, patient person in their life to the precise geographic coordinate where that person's empathy simply ceased to exist for them. The manipulator is left completely exposed, trapped inside the hollow wreckage of their own ego, forced to realize that they are entirely powerless against a human being who demands nothing, expects nothing, and feels absolutely nothing for them anymore.